Today, I'm speaking with Santosh Harish. Santosh leads Open Philanthropy's grantmaking in South Asia and air quality, which he's been doing from his office in India since the start of 2022.
How bad is air pollution?
Air pollution is the single largest environmental and occupational risk factor to public health globally. Per the Global Burden of Disease estimates, it accounts for something like 6.67 million deaths a year. This was as of 2019, which, to give context, is about 12% of all deaths globally, right? Not all of this is particulate matter. Particulate matter is the vast majority of this. A small fraction of this is what's called ground level ozone. But yeah, it's pretty bad. So when I started working on air pollution, which is about roughly a decade back, right? Some of these high numbers were sort of hard to sort of come to terms with, right? It almost seems implausibly large intuitively, because you're like, okay, well, it's bad. I mean, it's presumably bad for your lungs or something, but could it really be this bad? So the thing about air pollution which makes it so harmful, and in particular particulate matter air pollution, is that particulate matter is not a single substance, right? It's a cocktail of various things that are in the air that just happen to be finer than 2.5 microns in diameter, which is a tiny fraction of how thick your hair is. And it is composed of a variety of chemical substances, some of which are relatively harmless, some of which are extremely toxic. So it could be stuff like soil dust, which is sort of naturally occurring, or sea salt, which are likely to be not particularly harmful. And then there is stuff like lead and other heavy metals that are suspended in the air. There are inorganic compounds like sulfates and nitrates, which sort of originate from vehicular emissions, from coal power plant emissions, and so on. So it's a variety of different things. Because these particles are as fine as they are able to enter the lungs, enter the systemic circulation, and then basically these various things that have no business being in our body can sort of travel to different organs and cause a variety of different harms.
Yeah. What is perhaps the most outrageous or emotionally grabbing example of air pollution to you? So the thing that I have in mind is something that barely benefits the person who's emitting all of this pollution, but it's causing massive health damage to people in the nearby area.
One thing that comes to mind is sort of municipal waste burning that happens in sort of many cities in the global south. So basically this is waste that gets collected from people's homes, and instead of sort of being transported to a waste management facility or a landfill or something, basically gets burnt at some point, because that's like the fastest way to dispose of it, which really sort of points to poor delivery of public services, right? But this is like ubiquitous in virtually every small or even like medium-sized city. It happens in larger cities too in this part of the world. So I think that's something that sort of truly annoys me, because it feels like the kind of thing that ought to be fairly easily managed, but it happens a lot. It happens because people presumably don't think that it's particularly harmful. I don't think it saves a ton of money for the municipal corporations and other local government that are meant to sort of manage it. So that's one example that comes to mind. I find it particularly annoying simply because it happens so often. It's something that you're able to smell in so many different parts of these cities. Another which seems sort of downright evil to me is a whole bunch of industries that tend to not use the pollution control equipment that they have in their facilities already, right? And just basically like dump the flue gas, as it's called, the gas that gets emitted from the various processes in the industry, without the emission controls, in the middle of the night, when it's not obvious. I mean, it can't be detected as easily as it would in the day. And this is basically to, again, like save what I suspect is change, right? In terms of like maintenance and operation costs of this equipment. You have the equipment and there are these standards. And yeah, so that's, I think, downright evil on sort of the part of these industries.
Misconceptions about air pollution.
Yeah, so I think one that is actually a significant sort of a hindrance to effective policy in India and similar countries is that air pollution is assumed to be an urban problem. This was certainly true in sort of big industrial cities and so on, where sort of air pollution started becoming sort of visible and salient. So I'm thinking of London or Pittsburgh, Los Angeles. So in places like India, though, that's just not true, because rural air pollution can be significant. In fact, it's on average, rural exposure is not very different from urban exposure. One of the largest sources of air pollution exposure in India, in Pakistan, a whole bunch of other countries would actually be the household burning of solid fuels, wood and dung cakes and things like that. And so it's actually not at all an urban issue alone, and historically it has been treated as that. So, for example, there are no rural air quality monitors in India, and it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? So, till recently, the response to why there aren't monitors there was that, look, we know villages are clean. That's where you go when you have respiratory problems and so on, right? And so it neither gets sort of measured because it's assumed to be not a problem, and because there isn't any measurement to suggest otherwise, that never really gets updated. Because there are alternative sources of data now, satellite data-based estimates of air pollution, for example, I think there is growing evidence that rural air pollution can be substantial, and therefore there has been a growing demand for air quality monitoring in rural areas. Another sort of misconception that in some ways we touched upon, right, is that there are sort of safe levels of air pollution, that it's only like the truly apocalyptic levels that one sees, for example, in winters in places like Delhi and so on. Only that's what harms you. That unfortunately just doesn't seem to be true. Impacts have been detected at much lower levels that were previously considered safe. An unusual type of misconception that is sometimes popular in sort of government circles is that air pollution is something that you can build immunity to.
Oh, wow. I've never heard that one. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's something that, as ridiculous as that sounds, right? I mean,
well, I guess it's like if you go out in the sun a lot, maybe you get a tan, which slightly helps you to not get sunburned. But I don't imagine your body can do that with particulate pollution.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea is that, like everything else. So there is sort of this insistence by, I certainly don't think all regulators, but by some, that Indian lungs, for example, are just better able to handle air pollution than, for example, American lungs, right? Because we've been exposed to it.
You're used to it, okay.
Over a period of time, so we've got used to it. So we don't routinely fall sick when the levels of air pollution are high, and when somebody's visiting Delhi or something, you feel it. You feel the difference quite viscerally, and so that clearly points to like Indian lungs being better adapted. I mean, that's of course nonsense, but yeah, it's unfortunately like a persistent myth that has sort of been hard to shake off. One of the implications of that also has been a general skepticism towards like the public health impact estimates from sources like the GBD here. So there's sort of an insistence that we need more indigenous research, sort of studying health impacts, in Indian populations, and that these extrapolations from other parts of the world are just not relevant.
Why air pollution has gotten worse in India.
I think at a high level, it's less about policy mistakes than it has been about policy neglect, right? So the Air Act in India, sort of dates back to 1981. And in many ways, the regulatory apparatus that sort of resulted from the Air Act is sort of reflects the understanding, of that time, right? So the pollution control boards, there are pollution control boards at the state level and at the central or federal level. These have been primarily set up to deal with industrial pollution. because at the time, sort of that was the general sense that, this has got to be an industrial emissions kind of a problem. Over time, and so like in the mid to late 1990s, primarily because of sort of civil society advocacy and the interventions of the judiciary, the Supreme Court of India, it sort of expanded to include vehicular emissions in big cities. But till maybe the middle of the last decade, like around 2013, 2014, 2015, where in many ways air pollution once again started becoming more visible in Indian media, and therefore, sort of it became sort of more salient. And there were a bunch of these source apportionment studies that got commissioned and got publicized. That was it. So that was basically the extent to which the regulatory apparatus was ready. So these other sources like waste burning or household burning, they were completely neglected, right? Household burning, for example, and I think we've still not sort of recovered from that. It's assumed that the household burning of solid fuels is something that leads to indoor air pollution, and that really doesn't have much of an impact on pollution outdoors. That's just not true as per the literature. And so that's sort of been completely neglected and sort of treated as sort of a distinct problem. Because the regulatory apparatus has been set up for industrial pollution, the pollution control boards are not really well equipped to deal with sort of the updated understanding of where air pollution seems to come from, and therefore what you ought to be doing about it, right? So if you consider, for example, waste burning, this is something that really falls under the jurisdiction of the municipal corporations, the local government. The municipal corporations have never had to think about air pollution like ever, right? This simply isn't something that they think of as something that falls under their mandate till at least very recently. And therefore, the agencies that are supposed to be doing something about air pollution, the pollution control boards, don't have the jurisdiction on this source. The agencies that do have the jurisdiction are they have not had the regulatory experience or the capacity to deal with this. And therefore, it has sort of fallen between the cracks a bit. In terms of policy missteps, though, when it comes to industrial pollution, the regulatory regime in many ways has sort of not been designed in a manner that is flexible enough and sufficiently in sync with sort of the challenges of regulation in the field, right? So with industrial emissions, typically the way regulation functions is that all of these industries that pollute have chimney stacks, right? From where the flue gas and the other pollutants escape. For the longest time, across the world, regulation was basically about like the height of the chimney stack. So the assumption was that you make that tall enough and the impacts are not sort of felt in the immediate vicinity, which is not untrue, except that the pollution can travel and over time, all of this adds up. And so sort of the next generation of regulation in many ways was to set standards for what the concentrations of pollutants in these chimneys could be. So there is a mechanism by which the pollutants are measured in the chimney. You sort of compare it with what the regulatory standard ought to be. In order to comply with these standards, the industries basically install a bunch of pollution control equipment, scrubbers and filters and things called cyclones and so on, which are meant to sort of clean up the air. And regulators basically measure this from time to time. If you're found to be above the standards that have sort of been given to you, there is some form of, sort of punitive action, right? The way this mechanism has been set up in India has sort of relied on sort of what are called command and control instruments, right? So basically there is a standard. You're meant to be under that standard. Somebody comes and measures this from time to time. If you're above that standard, it is a criminal offense. And therefore, there's going to be like a lawsuit filed against you. You could land up in jail and sort of pay a fine of some kind. In practice, the legal system in India is sort of backed up. Most cases take years and years and years. If the actual compliance against these standards is quite poor, so even sort of based on some data from a few years back, something like 50% of industries in the state of Maharashtra, for example, were not in compliance with the particulate matter norms. So there's widespread non-compliance. The pollution control boards are understaffed. There is no real mechanism by which they can go after these many industries that are flouting the law. As a result, for the most part, the regulatory regime just sort of fails, right? So if a particular industry is found to be non-compliant, there is sort of a gentle slap on the wrist. There is some kind of polite correspondence where the regulator writes to the industry and sort of asks them to sort of explain themselves and sort of ends with that. There is very little action sort of taken. So the policy misstep, I guess, is that the sort of evolution that the regulatory framework should have had over time, from being reliant purely on these extremely rigid, some may say even sort of draconian command and control type regulations, towards a wider variety of sort of more flexible tools that allow the regulator to sort of levy fines, right, without having to like file a criminal lawsuit and so forth. That evolution just did not happen. And as a result, non-compliance became sort of widespread. The amount of industrial activity in the country increased. The pollution control boards were never really able to sort of keep up with it. And the one sort of source of air pollution that ought to have been sort of regulated well also did not see sort of much progress.
Why aren't people able to fix these problems?
From what I've heard, I think you mentioned in a talk that, oddly enough, in India, when air pollution comes up, the government often turns to, or city governments can turn to outdoor air purifiers, for example, as a possible solution. Maybe because it's very visible and it kind of looks cool, but is incredibly expensive and incredibly ineffective, as you might imagine. Sticking an air purifier outside, there's only so much that is possibly going to do if you haven't done anything to control the source of the air pollution. What is going wrong there? Why aren't people able to kind of fix these problems, given that it seems kind of obvious what improvements there might be?
Right. So starting with the outdoor air purifiers, right? So I guess the charitable way of seeing it, I mean, I'm a fairly optimistic person. So I guess one way you could see this is that this in some ways is a manifestation of the public demand for like cleaner air going up and like governments at least being forced to do something. And sort of smog towers, as they're called, are, you could imagine sort of the case for them, right? That they're sort of plausibly useful. Like, they'll do something. They're sort of physical, visible manifestations of the intent of governments to like clean up the air. And perhaps equally importantly, it leaves nobody worse off, I guess, in the near term. So
because taxpayers.
Yeah, the taxpayers, but it's sort of it's not as visible.
Spread very widely.
Exactly. And so that's one reason why smog towers are so attractive, that you don't actually have to, like, most regulation has winners and losers. And so here, except for, I guess, the taxpayers who might not be noticing it, nobody's really left worse off. And therefore it's sort of politically very viable. But yeah, I mean, let's be clear. This is an absolute waste of resources. They will do absolutely nothing. I mean, sure, they may clean up the air like a couple of meters away from wherever they are stationed, but that's it's highly ineffective. Part of the problem here seems to be that the sources are visible, sure. For some of them, there are like obviously good longer term actions that you ought to be taking. So vehicles are a problem. You need to like reduce the number of private vehicles on the road. You need to reduce the number of dirty vehicles on the road. So you can have a bunch of policy actions that try to clean up the fleet that could potentially, sort of improve the public transport infrastructure in cities and things like that. But in the near term, that sort of most governments try to sort of optimize for, right? One of the challenges is that we don't have like a menu of easy to implement sort of scalable solutions. I think that has been one of the challenges. And I think there's a legitimate uncertainty on, if you were a municipal commissioner, right, in one of the Indian cities, or you were the secretary for in the Department of Environment at a state level, and you had a pot of money to be able to deploy. I do think that there is a certain gap in terms of saying, okay, well, here are sort of the top 10 things that you ought to be doing. Here are like the sort of the most cost-effective interventions that you ought to be investing in. I think that's actually a significant gap in the literature. It's not sufficient to say that, you need to have more buses on the roads. That might not be under your mandate. That might be much more expensive than you can afford in the near term with the sort of constraints you've got. I think that's that's been one of the challenges with sort of being able to make progress in India. As a result, for the most part, what the cities have been doing is basically dust control type measures, right? Having these mechanical street sweepers clean up the roads. Like, they'll do something. We don't necessarily know how much they actually improve the air pollution, even on these roads. That's, for example, some of the stuff that we've just funded to try and get a handle on how much of an impact this might truly have. It's not obvious at all that these are cost-effective things to be putting your money behind, but it's the kind of thing where it's not expensive enough to, for the government agencies not to be able to procure them. And again, it's the kind of capital investments that the corporations can do more easily than some of the harder sort of improvements in terms of how you operate, how waste management in a particular city functions. I mean, that's like a systemic thing, right? It's much easier to purchase 10 of these street sweepers or something, put them on the road and hope to God that it sort of makes a difference. And unfortunately, that's what they've been doing.
The role that courts have played in air pollution regulation in India.
The judiciary has played an outsized and in many ways a completely unintuitive role in air pollution regulation in India. Basically, there's this instrument of public interest litigations that, that have been instrumental in leading to these court judgments. Some of these PILs, by the way, are still active, right? So there are cases that were initiated in the mid to late 90s that are still running today.
Sorry, you're saying that the court cases are still ongoing?
The court cases are still ongoing. And so, in a sense, there have been multiple sort of orders and judgments, but it hasn't sort of concluded. And the court continues to sort of play this quasi-executive, sometimes quasi-legislative, sometimes role in sort of designing policy. Some of those interventions, I think, were ultimately good and resulted in improvements. Some of those judgments have actually been pretty poor. The courts are simply not the places for some of these decisions to be made.
Yeah, in general, we don't expect courts to be a good place to be doing cost-benefit analysis and setting budgets and so on. That's like not their strength. It's not the strength of lawyers.
That's exactly right. And it's also not the place where you necessarily have a democratic reconciliation of the various people who are affected by the judgments. I mean, the case that you mentioned on the getting the buses off the road and this mandate that buses can only run on compressed natural gas. It's not obvious if the state government or the federal government would have made that call because it's not obvious that it sort of passes muster in terms of, who's left worse off. It did paralyze public transport in Delhi. It's also true that we can be reasonably confident that Delhi's air quality actually improved for almost a period of 5 to 8 years as a result of that ban. Like you said, the long-term impact was that more people then relied on private vehicles because the number of vehicles in Delhi boomed, and that sort of was the reason there was an uptick again in pollution levels, which eventually resulted in sort of increased attention and increased acknowledgement of the problem in, 2014, 2015. The catalyst in 2014, 2015 was unfortunately again the courts, right? So there has been that sort of problem of policy neglect has sort of manifested in the executive and to an even larger extent the legislature sort of completely ignoring the problem and the judiciary having to step in. The judiciary is sort of limited to fairly blunt instruments. The courts are not the places for cost-benefit analysis, as you put it, and that has unfortunate consequences. That's increasingly less and less the case, though. The courts have become less activisty over time. The smogtaverse in Delhi, by the way, was a direct result of a court judgment.
The what, sorry?
The outdoor air purifiers.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, that came as a direct result of... The courts basically demanded that, Supreme Court demanded that these be set up because something has to be done for Delhi's air quality.
Can philanthropists drive policy change?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm definitely fairly bullish about sort of the possibility of progress through the work that individual researchers and think tanks and policy advocacy groups can do. Yeah, I mean, I think there are certain areas where the possibilities of leverage are pretty high, and therefore small grants can have sort of outsized impact. One constraint as a grant maker here is sort of because I represent an international foundation, and sort of the foreign funding rules in India are fairly restrictive, and this is especially the case when it comes to sort of environmental work, which I think has often been interpreted as being adversarial when it comes to sort of industrial and economic development in India, right? So that does restrict the types of grants that one could make, right? So, for example, we talked about how the judiciary has had a huge influence. I am fairly ambivalent about sort of the overall the impact that the courts have had. I mean, I do think that some good things have happened as a result of it, but I also think that they're not necessarily the places where this decision making should be done. But either way, that seems like a potentially important institution to be able to influence or work with, right? But as a grant maker, like that's something that I can't touch.
I see.
Or at least have chosen not to touch. I mean, I think there are, sort of following the letter of the law, there's certain things that you can and cannot do, but there's also the spirit of the thing, and we have been fairly sort of careful. Media is sort of another sort of important sort of agent of change. Arguably, one of the things that ended up leading to sort of this increased pace of activity over, since maybe 2015, 2016 was that media outlets took notice, and there were just a lot more stories. And over a period of time, these stories became more and more sophisticated in sort of their understanding of the science of air pollution and, what governments ought to be doing and not doing and things like that. So that had an important role. Again, that's something that as an international foundation, we can't make direct grants to.
Oh, really? It's just not permitted to do anything regarding.
It's not permitted. You cannot you cannot fund journalists to sort of write stories, because it could be interpreted that this is basically like a foreign actor trying to influence sort of the media discourse and therefore the general narratives within a country. So some of those are the types of things that could plausibly lead to changes and have very high leverage, but stuff that we can't and should not do.
It's off the table, unfortunately.
They're off the table. As an Indian citizen, I understand where this comes from. Some of it,
yeah, of course,
seems to me as sort of being potentially defensive, but this really sort of feels above my pay grade, and I think it's entirely reasonable to sort of be compliant with the spirit of some of these restrictions, even if that means that you do have some opportunities off the table. I wish there was sort of more domestic funding in India that was sort of trying to go behind these opportunities and be engaged in air quality. That unfortunately has not been enough of the case. I mean, it's a fairly neglected area even from a domestic funding standpoint. So we've had to therefore restrict ourselves to certain types of grant-making opportunities. But I do think that there is still plenty of highly cost-effective opportunities on the table.